With that, this weekend would have been the Boynton Society Gala. This gala honors those who support Bjorklunden, and we celebrate their investment in the student experience and the summer seminar series offered at our beautiful Door County campus. To talk more about the impact of the Boynton Society, please welcome Jeff Reister, class of 1970, and Joni Reister, class of 1972, the co-chairs of the Boynton Society, for a few remarks.
Thank you, Shana. And thank you all for participating in our Learning at Lawrence series today. The Boynton Society supports operating and programming expenses at Bjorklunden, helping to keep it available to Lawrence students and to the Door County community as well. Boynton Society members also provide vital support for the Student Weekend Seminar program at Lawrence, which allows Lawrence students to experience Door County's relaxed pace and peaceful atmosphere away from the traditional classroom setting. These distinctive educational opportunities help to set Lawrence apart from other colleges and universities.
We know that at this time of year, many of you like to hear some statistics about how things are going at Lawrence's northern campus. So here goes. In the 2019-2020 academic year, which didn't have an on-campus spring term, Bjorklunden still hosted 1,154 people during fall and winter terms, on pace with previous school years. That number included 969 students and 91 faculty members, taking part in the usual fascinating array of immersive, relaxing weekend experiences. The 2019 Bjorklunden Summer Seminars welcomed 696 participants, the second highest number ever. These experiences are supported by gifts from donors of all stripes, but especially by Boynton Society members. I like to think of us as the Friends of Bjorklunden. In the fiscal year which ended June 30, there were 674 donors to Bjorklunden, giving $438,322. This extraordinary figure included some special earmarked gifts to endowments and to start up a special fund for a new initiative about which you will hear more soon. The fiscal 2020 contributions also included gifts from 393 Boynton Society members totaling $269,500, funds which are spent at Bjorklunden for operating expenses and without which Bjorklunden wouldn't be a positive line item on the college's budget. Outstanding results during challenging times. Thank you so much for your support. If you are inspired to give to Bjorklunden or to become a new Boynton Society member, please visit the Lawrence website, the university's website, at lawrence.edu and follow the links to Bjorklunden/Boynton Society. And now, back to Shana.
Thank you so much, Jeff and Joni. It's so great to see you both. But now on to introduce our featured speaker for today. Tim Crain is the director of the National Catholic Center for Holocaust Education, and he is a beloved, frequent presenter at Bjorklunden. I believe that this would have been his 16th summer if he had been there in person this week. His presentation today is entitled The Flu Epidemic of 1918 and COVID-19, Learning from the Past. Thank you, Tim, for your willingness to be a presenter for our Learning at Lawrence series. If you have any questions for Tim, please submit them via the chat function. We'll have time for answers at the end of his presentation. And now for our featured speaker, Tim Crain.
Good afternoon. What a tremendous, tremendous honor it is for me to be with all of you today. I feel as though I've been adopted almost by Lawrence University over the course of the past 15 years. This would have been my 16th summer at Bjorklunden. And just looking back, it all began with a good friend of mine, Bob Duty, Lawrence alum, who was auditing one of my classes at the University of Wisconsin and told me about a potential opportunity. And he introduced me to the director of Bjorklunden, Mark Briesman, another fantastic person, and went up for the first seminar. It was all the way back in 2005 before the huge addition was put on the lodge. And Mark, over the first couple of years, was talking. He says, maybe you want to do a second seminar. I said, over the course of the summer. I said, that sounds fantastic. And then he turned to my wife and I, because of course my 3 kids always are up there with us as well. And he said to Paula, my wife, he said, your kids can grow up here. And that's exactly what's happened. And the memories that they have of Bjorklunden are fantastic, as too is the case with myself and my wife as well. By the same token, it's as I was perusing the list of names yesterday, I saw a great many familiar names, and I miss you all so very, very much. It's a strange time, strange year for ourselves as well as the nation as a whole, but this too shall pass, and things will invariably improve. So what I'd like to do today is I'm going to talk for probably about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll open the floor for any questions. I'll hang around for as long as you'd like. And the primary focus is going to be what happened, the events in 1918 in American history, the Great Flu Epidemic, as it in fact was formally called. And the issue here, or basically with this flu epidemic, what you'll see already going through as we're in the midst of a pandemic with COVID-19, you'll see the parallels right on across the board. I guess probably in terms of an opening comment, before we actually dive in, is to say that one of the more interesting aspects of history, and I'm a historian, so obviously that's my focus. One of the more interesting aspects of history is that although technology has changed over the course of 5,000 years of recorded history, and changed quite strikingly, human nature has not. We haven't really made all that great of advances in terms of human nature here across the board. And we see this as we're looking at 1918, and we're also going to be seeing parallels as well with the formal present day. But what I'd like to do to formally start off is that in terms of the flu epidemic of 1918, it was more commonly known as the Spanish flu. And you can see here with the sign from a harbor that the Spanish influenza has endangered the prosecution of the war in Europe. Of course, it takes place in the backdrop of World War I, which we'll be talking about here momentarily. There are 1,500 cases in the Navy Yard. 30 deaths have already resulted. Spitting spreads Spanish influenza, don't spit. Well, in this regard, this is actually a misnomer. Although it's called the Spanish flu, up to and including the present day, it didn't originate in Spain. It happens during World War I. And with the media blackout, it was a necessity for the Allied powers, for the Central powers to keep any negative news away from their respective populations, very common in war, up to and including the present day. And what would happen here, what would in fact unfold in these situations is that Spain ended up as a neutral nation in Europe, one of the few neutral nations in all of World War I. So Spain's media was, the newspapers, the reporting, et cetera, was a bit more open. And the Spanish were widely reporting on this flu epidemic that was taking place here in 1918. It was hitting Europe very, very hard, would hit the world very hard, obviously as well, the United States. So the Spanish are reporting on it. The Spanish didn't refer to it as the Spanish flu, they call it the French flu, because they believe firmly they were getting it from France. So the French were being blamed. The French call it the Spanish flu, the name stuck, and hence in the present day, that is what it's referred to as. But the issue here on a more significant level is the fact that the epidemic of 1918, which we'll be referring to it as, takes place, of course, during World War I, and it creates, with its origins in the United States, it creates here what could best be described as this perfect storm. And you'll see many of the challenges in 1918 corresponding directly with the challenges that our nation, and quite frankly, the world is also facing here with COVID-19. Well, the United States, first in terms of setting a little bit of background information to the flu itself. The United States over the course of the 19th century continued to expand in a very rapid fashion. You had this mass migration, the old immigrants who came in the first half of the 19th century. The Great Divide here led the United States to the American Civil War, which goes from 1861 to 1865, formally concludes with the preservation of the Union and a tremendous sense of hope, of optimism for the future of this very new nation. Well, you have this expansion going on in the midst of these cries of "Go West, young man," pushing well beyond the Mississippi River. And by the same end, the United States in 1880 began opening its doors, the floodgates, so to speak, encouraging people to come to this nation. It was very, very open because you needed this people power as much as possible to grow, to prosper. In 1880, the United States, the population of the United States stood at 76 million people. By 1918, that number had risen to 110 million people. 80% of the newcomers during this great wave of immigration to the United States, 80% of the newcomers to the US were from Europe, the majority of them from Eastern Europe, Central Europe. The remaining 20% were from Mexico, Canada, and the Philippines. And the vast majority of them here in this time period are settling across the Northeast in cities as well as into the Midwest. This huge belt would be forming, this huge expansion. The impact that would have on the United States as a nation would indeed be astounding. Take into consideration here the following, okay, in terms of immigration to this nation through this time period. In 1918, 60% of the residents of New York City, Boston, Philadelphia, Providence were born outside of this country in 1918. 70% of the residents of Milwaukee, Chicago, St. Paul, St. Louis were born in 1918 outside of this country. Classic example, the city of Milwaukee. The city of Milwaukee in 1918 had more German language newspapers than it had English language newspapers. We see this transition, this transformation, this huge surge, the American dream becoming all the more of a reality for these newcomers in search of a better life. Their lives, for the most part, were going to be overwhelmingly difficult, but they could see the writing on the wall that things for their children, their grandchildren would in fact be better. Well, the United States as a nation is also in this phase of becoming this world power here as the 19th century moves on. This modern industrialized power through and through, in league with these historic European nations. Britain, which had made the 19th century the British century through and through. France, the second most prominent nation in the world throughout the 19th century. The British and the French, Europe in general, had dominated the globe going all the way back to the 1100s. Germany would join here as well, a nation that does not come into existence until 1871, never here from a political perspective, able to get itself together. Well, it does under the leadership of Otto von Bismarck. Becomes here this up and coming global power. So too is the case with the Asian nation of Japan. And the key here to being this modernized state or states across the board was to be experiencing this industrial revolution. Well, such was the case with the United States, no doubt about it. There were advances made here as well in the late 19th, early 20th century in the area of science and medicine, which greatly expanded here life expectancy. Take into consideration the following. In 1880, the life expectancy of an American citizen stood at 39 years. Now, over the course of thousands of years of human history, on average, people live somewhere between 35 to 39 years. Very, very short, obviously, at least by today's standards. Horrifying, quite frankly, if you think about it. Well, those numbers were skewed a bit due to the fact that you have a high infant mortality rate. Well, in 1880, 39 years was the life expectancy in the United States. By 1900, it had risen to 47 years. By 1918, it had risen to 54 years. Medicine, science is going to play a role here in aiding this process. In the present day, we're almost at 80 years. Quite extraordinary in terms of the advances, in terms of the changes that have in fact been brought about over the course of the past 100, 150 years. Well, for the United States, this up and coming global power, the sky indeed seemed to be the limit. And the 20th century would ultimately end up as the American century, as the 19th century had in fact been the British century. There was tremendous optimism in the nation of the US at the turn of the 20th century. This is very, very big, very important, because there was hope that all of these good things would continue to grow and prosper as the new century began. Well, the 20th century would become the most violent century in all of human history, unfortunately. Again, the negative side of human nature. More people are going to die in the 20th century. In that one century, more people are going to die in warfare than died in all 5,000 years of recorded history before it combined. What does this say about the darker side of human nature? Technology had improved, so too had the weapons of murder vastly improved. Well, World War I begins. It begins effectively on July 28, 1914. And it begins here with these allied powers, Britain, France, and Russia, taking on the Central Powers. Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria would eventually join the Central Powers as well. And you have this monumental war, and the Europeans had forgotten the horrors of war. There had been large-scale peace across the European landscape going all the way back to the time of the defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. Well, the war begins, and it will be fought over the course of many different fronts. The predominant front, as you can see here on our slide, will be the Western Front in northern France and into the nation of Belgium. The Western Front is the most important front because it's going to pit Britain and France on one side against the German army on the other side. Whoever wins the Western Front is going to indeed win the war. There will be other fronts as well here: the Italian Front, the Dardanelles Balkans Front, the Eastern Front, etc. Well, for the United States, this nation, eventually it would get itself involved here in this war as well. Remember Uncle Sam, a very iconic poster for the American experience in World War I. I want you for the US Army. But the United States, as the guns of August begin booming here in 1914 in Europe, the United States, under the leadership of its Democratic president from the state of New Jersey, Woodrow Wilson, proclaims its strict neutrality. It proclaims here its strict neutrality. Now, the US is going to steer clear of this. It had basically been very successful following the American Civil War, expanding, growing its economy, taking in millions of newcomers. It was this manufacturing superpower, and it was very, very wise indeed. What the US will be doing, though, from the start will be following a very pro-Allied stance for the British and the French. And the reason being is that they're going to be trading extensively with Britain and France. The Americans are going to be selling things at top dollar, and the British and the French would take anything they could, quite frankly, whether it would be weaponry for the war, food, clothing, you name it. The Americans would send it, they would sell it. And the United States, in this sort of arrangement, is going to do very well. The US indeed will emerge. It will emerge as the world's predominant power, and we can give an exact year to this, 1915. The financial center of the globe had been the city of London. Now, by the end of 1915, that's going to shift across to the city of New York. All currencies of the world for centuries have been measured against the British pound sterling. Now, that too is going to shift. They would all be measured against the American dollar. An extraordinary transformation for this one-time colony indeed. So the US has a vested interest and will be pro-Allied because it's selling things extensively to Britain and France. The British and the French eventually are going to run out of money. The US will then float them $10 billion in loans. The United States is going to be receiving all of its war reports coming from London. So propaganda plays a major role for the American population. They see this as a struggle against good versus evil. Germany and the Central Powers are the personification of evil through and through. the British, the French, the Allies, they're trying to protect the women, the children across all of historic Europe. They're the focus of extraordinary good, 100%. Well, what happens here is as this relationship continues, the Germans realize that World War I has become a war of goods, and whichever side can in fact formally outproduce the other is going to emerge victorious. Will in fact here emerge victorious. It is in this sense, therefore, that the Germans send word to the United States that you are not acting in a neutral fashion, and if this continues, we will have no choice but to begin attacking with our German U-boats, begin attacking German subs, torpedoing and sinking American merchant ships across the North Sea. If you're a neutral nation, act as though you're a neutral nation, because this is strangling here in this war of goods, Germany into surrender. Well, President Woodrow Wilson sends word to the Germans, you best leave American shipping alone. Well, in early 1917, the Germans begin continuing to sink American ships. And on April 6, 1917, after Woodrow Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war, the United States declares war here on Germany and the Central Powers. Well, across the nation of the United States, you have this huge surge of nationalism, tremendous surge of nationalism, this rally around the flag effect, as political scientists will refer to it as. George M. Cohan, an Irish immigrant himself, would put out all these patriotic songs such as Over There, You're a Grand Old Flag. And you have here this sense that it is imperative to go and defeat the German Hun. This would be the war to end all wars, as far as the idealistic Americans were concerned. The war to make the world safe for democracy. Well, you have this transition, this transformation going on, and indeed the involvement in what had been a stalemate of the United States now on the side of the Allied powers. As the American doughboys, as they're referred to as, will start joining, it's going to tip the scales, tip here in essence the scales in favor of the Allied cause in World War I. Well, it would take the United States 1 full year to be effectively mobilized on the Western Front. You're going to have to train soldiers, you're going to have to draft, you're going to have to, it's very, very important, recruit whoever you can recruit. It's a monumental undertaking. So the US will not even be in full force in Europe until the spring of 1918. By the same token, as 1917 progresses and now the United States is on the same side as the Allies, there is a silent enemy at work as the year in fact formally comes to an end. Well, in 1918, in the month of January, the flu epidemic effectively begins. Now, eventually, it would become here this global pandemic, a global pandemic that would take the lives of 50 million people. 15 million people die in all of World War I, making it the single most destructive war in all of human history up to that time. 50 million people will die here in the midst of this pandemic of 1918. It would infect here 500 million people globally, and it lasted just 15 months. In January of 1918, a physician in Haskell County, Kansas, reported to the US Public Health Services unusual flu activity in his community. And within 2 months, at a nearby fort here, training soldiers for World War I, Fort Riley in Kansas, on March 11th, 1918, Army private was diagnosed with the same flu that this physician had been describing. By noon of March 11th, at Fort Riley, more than 100 soldiers were ill with the flu. Now, the symptoms are fairly mundane for flu, to be perfectly honest. Fever, most common, sore throat, as well as a headache. Usually they were all there together. And despite here medical advances, scientific changes that had been made, that had been indoctrinated, that was improving, in essence, the quality of life in the United States. In the US as well as globally, very little was known about viruses at this time. Well, as word began to filter out, a News of the World report recommended the following in terms of dealing with this flu. And I quote, "Wash the inside of your nose with soap and water each night and morning. Force yourself to sneeze at night and morning. Then breathe deeply. Do not wear a muffler. Take sharp walks regularly, and remember to eat plenty of porridge," end quote. Yes, porridge perhaps at this time was something of a cure-all, I'm not sure. Well, for the Fort Riley soldiers, what they did is they carried this flu with them to other American military bases across the United States for more specialized training or what other area they were going into. And eventually they carried it to the battlefields of Europe, to the Western Front in France. Well, this flu strain here was not at all uncommon, and it was rarely fatal. What we could describe in essence as this first wave. Rarely was it fatal. And it impacted the Western Front in France, no doubt, as American soldiers began arriving in greater and greater numbers. British soldiers are getting sick, French soldiers are getting sick, German soldiers are getting sick, right on across the board. But the French referred to it as the 3-day fever. After 72 hours, you were fine. No problems at all. Nevertheless, the flu continued to spread over the summer of 1918. And by August of 1918, it had become this global phenomenon. What made this flu, as it was considered to be, well, it's cold and flu season, where it started, etc., no big surprise, it's holding on in the summer, usually it's not as strong then. But what made this flu strain so dangerous was its unique pathology. To give an example, most seasonal flu would bind itself only to the upper respiratory tract. So if it's bound to the upper respiratory tract, it makes it fairly easy to spread, but it also lowers the chances of developing pneumonia, a very, very dangerous aspect of it. But with this flu strain, as 1918 continued, it bound itself not just to the upper respiratory tract, it also bound itself to the lower respiratory tract, therefore making it very contagious and far, far more deadly. Pathologists looked here at lung tissue of these early victims and saw that they were full of fluid as well as hemorrhages, but they failed to see the connection and misdiagnosed many of these early victims with other infectious diseases. Well, the first wave came to an end in 1918, relatively, once again, non-lethal. The second wave, however, would prove to be the opposite. The second wave would in fact prove to be the opposite. Here is a warehouse that is converted into a hospital in Massachusetts at Camp Devens. The second wave began in September of 1918. A soldier in September of 1918 was sent here to the camp hospital at Camp Devens, which is about 35 miles from Boston, with what was thought to be meningitis. Well, the next day, or the following day, 15 more soldiers would report to the camp hospital with the same symptoms. Is this meningitis? What is the problem here? A few days later, at Camp Devens, outside of Boston, 1,543 soldiers were sent to the camp hospital, and they were diagnosed with the flu. Well, at the time, creating in essence this perfect storm, at the time, Boston was one of the 5 largest cities in the United States, with its close proximity and going back and forth with Camp Devens, it's going to hit the city of Boston in a massive fashion. And it will start spreading. It's going to start to spread here throughout the entire United States, especially impacting large cities. Well, the death toll would continue to climb. Physicians in Boston and at Camp Devens were perplexed, besmirched. What is going on here? Some of these young men would be coming to the hospital very ill with the flu. Within an hour, they would turn blue and they would die within a few hours more. It didn't make any sense. They're in the prime of their life. They're in very, very good physical condition. How could this be happening? Many of the reports from the physicians, not just in Boston and at Camp Devens, but as it started to spread across the United States here in September of 1918, they talked here as well in terms of these victims coughing up blood and bleeding as well from their nose, from their mouth, as well as even their eyes. It was a terrible, terrible thing. How to respond, what to do, how to react, that became the ultimate question. The death toll was staggering. In Philadelphia, in just one day, in mid-September of 1918, 759 people died from the flu. It impacted the very young and the very old, like flu oftentimes does. But what also made this all the more horrific is that people between the ages, men and women between the ages of 20 to 35 were getting hit particularly hard. What to do, how to respond wasn't exactly clear. Funeral homes were overwhelmed. They were overwhelmed. And in countless cities across the United States, to keep up with burying hundreds and hundreds, thousands upon thousands of corpses here as September of 1918 progressed and early October progressed, what they began doing across the United States was digging mass graves. Many funeral home directors gave the authority to the family members that if you want your loved one buried in a private plot, you have to dig the grave yourself. We simply can't do it. It cannot be done. We're overwhelmed at this stage, making it here obviously even more painful for these families. Streets were deserted. Cities across the United States looked like ghost towns. The death toll continued to skyrocket. In October of 1918, in October, the month of October alone, 1918, 195,000 Americans died of the flu. 195,000 in 1 month. Well, in terms of what to do, how to react to this, wasn't entirely clear. Officials in many communities, there wasn't going to be this national overview or national approach. The focus, you have to understand, is World War I. We've got to win the war. This is the overwhelming focus. And it became for the communities to take the initiative to respond in terms of if they were getting hit hard with the flu, in terms of what to do. Well, officials in many communities across the United States, they shut down schools, they shut down churches, theaters, libraries, etc. Second of all, they advised Americans to stay home, unless it was absolutely necessary. In essence, they're encouraging here a lockdown. Third, avoid shaking hands. It wasn't so much of a focus of washing hands. It was avoid shaking hands, because that can spread disease as well. It could spread the flu. Many Americans were instructed to take aspirin. Now, aspirin had been invented in the late 19th century, was viewed as something of a cure-all in some circles. But what happened here, as the pandemic just started to explode in the fall of 1918, many Americans began taking 30 grams of aspirin each day. That is a lethal amount. 4 grams are considered unsafe in the present day. And Americans were taking 30 grams a day. Well, this also played a role in contributing to a great many deaths. Fifth, thousands of businesses shut down and never reopened. Misery was commonplace. It was commonplace across the nation. Many Americans ignored here the epidemic. And although it was reported that there's a flu going on, you need to take cover, you need to be very careful, et cetera, here are the recommendations, so on and so forth, many Americans saw it as, it's just the flu. It's going to go away. We have the flu all the time. Yes, it's a strain, it's probably a more virulent strain, but it's going to go away very soon. Certainly this was the case over the course of the month of September. And it depended on the cities, depended on the state. Some states were very aggressive, some states were not in 1918. Well, one city that was basically seeing this as nothing more than a passing thing was the city of Philadelphia. And on September 28th, 1918, the Liberty Loan Parade was set. Now, what this was, in essence, is this was a parade for war bonds, to raise money to help the American effort here in World War I. Well, large crowds were to be avoided as far as most of the nation was concerned. Philadelphia was not going to go back on its parade, and more than 200,000 people were in attendance for this massive war bond parade. Well, within a few days, Philadelphia, which did not close schools, it did not close churches, it did not shut down businesses, it did not shut down saloons. Within just a few days, there were 47,000 cases of flu in the city of Philadelphia. Within 10 days of this parade, over 12,000 people died in Philadelphia alone. Well, then what happened in Philadelphia is schools were closed, businesses shut down, saloons closed, etc. But not until this. By comparison, the city of St. Louis. St. Louis had a same parade. The Liberty Loan Parade was set on September 28th, 1918. And St. Louis, as far as they were concerned, this is nothing to mess with. St. Louis had already shut down schools, already shut down businesses, etc., had been very vigilant, was being criticized for overreacting to the threat. And when the parade is canceled over the same time period where Philadelphia suffered 12,000 deaths in the 10 days that followed, you would have here a death toll of just over 100 in the city of St. Louis. In fact, throughout the whole pandemic here on 1918, the death toll in St. Louis, a comparable sized city to Philadelphia at the time, was 1/8 that of Philadelphia. Well, as time marched on, as time here in fact marched on, the United States continued its war efforts here on the Western Front of France, and slowly but sure in 1918, the tide began to turn against Germany and the Central Powers. The hope was that the war would end in a very, very rapid fashion. But as I stressed, it started here at a military camp in the United States, the flu epidemic of 1918, in Kansas. Then it expanded even more in another military camp outside of Boston, later in 1918. Well, in 1918, more American soldiers will die. They will die here of the flu than were killed on the battlefields in the American experience in World War I. Speaks volumes as to how unbelievably lethal the strain was. In 1918 alone in the United States, the average life expectancy dropped 12 years. On November 11th, 1918, World War I came to an end. It came to an end. Germany was forced, with basically no other hope, by late September of 1918 to ask for terms of an armistice. And on the 11th day of the 11th month at 11 a.m. 1918, Germany signs the armistice, this agreement to stop fighting, and all was at last quiet on the Western Front. This horrific war had taken the lives of 15 million people and had now come to an end, with victory for the Americans, the British, the French, the Allies, and defeat for Germany and the Central Powers. Well, the United States was basically warning against large gatherings because the flu is still alive and well. You have this death toll that's ever increasing. Early November is also very bad. We need to be vigilant. But as far as the American public was concerned, the focus was this war to end all wars, and now it's over. And we have made the world safe for democracy. There would be thus these extraordinary celebrations. Extraordinary celebrations across cities, the end of the war here in November of 1918. Well, what this led to, not surprisingly, was a surge in flu cases, going hand in hand with this surge in flu cases, a surge here in deaths. How to approach this, what to do, wasn't entirely clear. Well, in 1918, especially following this horrific month of September and continuing on into October, it was encouraged in many communities, especially in the Western United States, to wear masks, okay? To begin to wear masks. This would protect you, or this would help here the spread of the virus. Well, masks became particularly prominent in San Francisco, Seattle, Denver, and Phoenix. And they made this as part of the war effort. You're going to, in terms of war bonds, we're going to support our soldiers, we're for our forces 100%. This is our crusade 100% across the board. Well, you also have this movement that by wearing a mask, you're showing your support for our forces in Europe. Well, if you refused to wear a mask, you were called a mask slacker. And that meant that you were against our forces. You were making a political statement by not wearing your mask. Well, most of these masks were made of gauze and weren't overly helpful. Cigars were very prominent here in the United States at this time, and a lot of men would smoke cigars right through, just cut a hole in the gauze, and that wasn't a problem if they were forced to. But those who were against it, and there were a good many who opposed wearing masks, said that first and foremost, they're hot and stuffy. Second of all, this whole mask thing is creating great fear in public when we should try to calm the population down. We don't want to rattle them. They've got enough on their minds. And third and most significant of all, this is an infringement. This is an infringement on my rights as a freedom and liberty loving American. Well, one of the areas hardest hit by the flu was the city of San Francisco. For every 1,000 residents in 1918, for every 1,000 residents here in San Francisco in 1918, 30 of them died because of the flu. Well, the city of San Francisco thus made it a policy you had to wear a mask. Well, this led to the Anti-Mask League. The Anti-Mask League. The Anti-Mask League has its origins after the United States emerges victorious. It really starts to experience here its foundation in December of 1918. Of course, the war ends victoriously in November of 1918. And they set a meeting to protest still having to wear these masks because we showed our loyalty. The war is over, we've won, we're not wearing the mask anymore. Well, over 2,000 attendees in San Francisco in early January protested here having to wear these masks, and that this should in fact be set aside once and for all. Well, in January of 1919, a third wave set off, but the third wave would not be anywhere near as potent as the second wave had been. It'll be more comparable, I would say, to the first wave. The vast majority of Americans are going to die. They are going to die here during the second wave of the epidemic, really from September to December of 1918. 675,000 Americans died due to the flu epidemic in 1918. Now, to put this in its proper perspective, those 675,000 Americans who die in 1918 and a few months into 1919, that is more than all of the Americans who died in World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam combined. In the present day, because our population is about 327 million, in the present day, this would be the equivalency of over 2 million Americans dying at the hands of this pandemic, this silent killer, right on across the board. The flu killed everybody. The young, the old, the in-between. And why it came to an end, basically, is that it either would kill people by 1919, or you developed an immunity from it. In 2008, researchers learned what made this flu so deadly. That what you had here was a group of 3 genes that enabled the virus to weaken bronchial tubes and lungs. What this did is that it cleared the way for bacterial pneumonia. Okay? So it was like a perfect storm inside of bodies, went right on across the board. And you have here the American doughboys in World War I on the Western Front. What you have here in terms of hospitals, they were overloaded. They weren't exactly sure what to do. Countless nurses, physicians also caught the flu and died. Okay, here in the front lines, literally from a domestic political scene. Signs would appear. This one's on a trolley car in the city of Chicago. Keep your bedroom windows open, prevent influenza, pneumonia, and tuberculosis. We have to be vigilant here, American people. Barber shops closed temporarily, but when they reopened here, barbers in most parts of the United States were required to wear masks. So you can see here in these photographs, the first one is from San Francisco. The second one, this is taken from Cincinnati. And here's a photograph in San Francisco. Somebody who on the right is no doubt part of the anti-mask movement. Right? And a police officer, it looks like it's staged, quite frankly. Police officer is confronting him basically in terms of, where is your mask? Get a $5 fine. And a $5 fine if you were not in fact wearing your mask. So you have here in the United States, in the midst of this pandemic, other pandemics would follow. Other pandemics here would follow. In 1957, 2 million people died globally, 70,000 in the United States. 1968, 1 million people died in another flu pandemic. 34,000 of them were Americans. 2001, we had the H1N1 or swine flu epidemic, result in the deaths of 12,000 Americans. And of course, what we're going through now in the present day, COVID-19. And the question here is what to do, what the wisest course of action is. But if you look back at the lessons learned of 1918, something that was simply not talked about very much at all in the years that followed, something that the United States would almost rather forget about, sweep it to the curb if at all possible, that you see here these striking parallels. Social distancing, closing down places where large amounts of people could be. I mean, the list here across the board is endless. Because with COVID-19, what we have learned is first and foremost, it is highly contagious. Highly contagious. It is also incredibly lethal. Usually, in terms of what the specialists, what the experts tell us, if something is highly contagious, it's generally not lethal. Well, in 1918, it was highly contagious and it was lethal. So too appears to be the case with COVID-19 in 2020. What adds to this is that with the flu epidemic of 1918, you had symptoms. Now, in the present day, so many are asymptomatic, which helps in terms of the spread all the easier. And you can see in terms of the example of Philadelphia, that really didn't go into a shutdown mode. Some other places that perhaps opened too early. We see this as well in the United States in this ongoing struggle. And it leads to another surge, just in a different area. We can learn here these lessons from the past. We can learn indeed the lessons of the past because they can be tremendously helpful. History repeats itself, never exactly, but there are definite trends here that we can in fact formally see. And with coronavirus, as I speak, we have about 4.8 million infections here at this time, a death toll that probably today will reach 160,000 Americans. What the end of the road is, isn't exactly clear. by the same end, in terms of looking big picture and lessons learned, there's the warning that comes from us historians who would say that those who do not learn from the mistakes of history are doomed to repeat them. Thank you so very much.